You know, they say success changes people. But what they don't tell you is that it also reveals them. It shows you who they really are beneath the polish and the performance. Aries Langston understood this better than most. She'd built an empire from nothing, and along the way, she'd made herself a promise. Never forget where you came from, and never let power turn you into the kind of person who forgets that everyone deserves respect. 3 years ago, on what should have been a routine flight, that promise was put to the test. And let me tell you, what happened that day is a story worth telling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's continue. It was a Tuesday morning when Aries found herself preparing for a flight from Los Angeles to New York. She had meetings scheduled with potential investors, contracts to review, and decisions to make that would affect thousands of employees. But you wouldn't know any of that by looking at her. By then, Aries had spent over 2 decades in the aviation industry. She knew that flying wasn't just about getting from one city to another. It was about the experience, the service, the small human interactions that happened at 30,000 feet. That's why when she'd invested everything she had into a struggling regional carrier and eventually became the majority owner of what would become Horizon Airways, she'd built the company on a single principle. Treat every person who steps onto your aircraft like they matter. No exceptions, no excuses. But here's something Aries had learned early in her journey to the top. True power doesn't need to announce itself. Real success doesn't require a spotlight or a stage. She'd watched too many people mistake volume for authority, watch them parade their wealth like armor, as if the price tag on their clothes could substitute for the content of their character. She'd promised herself she would never become that person. So that Tuesday, Aries dressed the way she always did when she traveled. A light gray sweater, soft and comfortable. Dark blue jeans, well-fitted but unremarkable. White sneakers that had seen better days, but still had plenty of life left in them. Her natural curly hair fell loosely around her shoulders, styled simply, without fuss or pretense. No designer labels screamed for attention. No jewelry announced her net worth. Just a woman in her late 20s, carrying a modest shoulder bag and a first-class boarding pass for seat 2A, the window seat she'd selected weeks earlier when she booked the flight. Aries had always been punctual. It was something her grandmother had insisted upon when she was a girl growing up in a small Texas town. Respect other people's time, her grandmother would say, and they'll respect yours. The lesson had stuck. She arrived at LAX a full 90 minutes before departure, moved through security with practiced ease, picked up a bottle of water and a newspaper, and made her way to the gate. The boarding process was smooth and efficient. When the gate agent called for first-class passengers, Aries gathered her bag and joined the small queue. She nodded politely to the crew members as she stepped onto the aircraft, taking in the familiar scent of recycled air and cleaning solution, the soft ambient lighting, the quiet hum of conversation. And that's when she saw him. You know how sometimes you can sense a person's energy before you even see their face? How certain people seem to take up more space than their physical form should occupy? That's what struck Aries first about the man standing in the aisle near the front of the cabin. Even from behind, even before she could see his expression or hear his voice, she knew exactly what type of person he was. Ryan Wood stood with his back partially turned, speaking into his phone with the kind of voice that demanded attention. He wore a dark gray tailored jacket that fit him like it had been sculpted to his frame, paired with black slacks that probably cost more than most people spent on rent. His white dress shirt was crisp enough to cut paper. His shoes, polished black leather, caught the overhead lights with each subtle movement. And on his wrist, a watch, the kind of timepiece that wasn't about telling time, but about telling everyone around you that you could afford not to care about time. But it wasn't the expensive clothing that made Aries pause. It was the way he carried himself, the way he gestured impatiently at a flight attendant who was clearly trying to help another passenger. The way he seemed to radiate an unspoken message to everyone around him. I am important. You are not. Make way. Aries continued down the narrow aisle, politely excusing herself as she passed other passengers stowing their carry-ons. She offered a warm smile to the young flight attendant who welcomed her aboard, noted the nervous energy in the woman's eyes as she glanced toward the man on his phone. When Aries reached row 2, she stopped. There he was. Ryan Woods. Sitting in her seat, 2A, the window seat she had specifically selected and paid for. His laptop was open on the tray table, documents spread across the screen in what looked like some complex financial analysis. His leather briefcase occupied the middle seat, 2B, as if he'd purchased the entire row. His phone was pressed to his ear, and he was typing with his free hand, completely absorbed in whatever urgent business consumed him. Aries had never been someone who enjoyed confrontation. Throughout her career, she'd learned that the best leaders were often the quietest ones, the people who led by example rather than volume. She believed in addressing problems with calm, with respect, with the assumption that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding rather than malice. So she cleared her throat gently, waited for a break in his phone conversation, and spoke in a voice that was polite but clear. "Excuse me, sir. I believe you're in my seat." Ryan didn't look up. His fingers continued flying across his keyboard. His phone conversation continued without pause. It was as if she hadn't spoken at all, as if she wasn't even there. Aries waited a moment, giving him the benefit of the doubt. The cabin was filling up around them. Other passengers were shuffling past, voices overlapping, overhead bins clicking shut. Maybe he simply hadn't heard her over the noise. She spoke again, a bit louder this time, her tone still measured and respectful. "Excuse me, this is seat 2A, that's my assigned seat." This time, Ryan heard her. This time, he looked up, and the look he gave her, Aries would remember it for the rest of her life. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without saying a word. His eyes traveled from her face, taking in her features with a quick, dismissive scan, then down to her simple gray sweater, her casual jeans, her worn sneakers, then back up to her face. The entire assessment took maybe 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds, Ryan Woods made a judgment. He sized her up, measured her worth, and found her completely beneath his notice. His expression didn't change. No apology formed on his lips. No acknowledgement of the possibility that he might be in the wrong. Instead, his face remained neutral, perhaps slightly annoyed, as if she were an interruption to something far more important than basic courtesy or airline policy. "The seat's taken," he said flatly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected no further discussion. Then, without waiting for a response, he returned his attention to his laptop, his phone, his world where other people's concerns simply didn't register. Aries stood there in the aisle, her boarding pass still in her hand, feeling the weight of that dismissal settle over her. But it wasn't hurt she felt. It wasn't even anger. Not yet. It was something else entirely. Recognition. Familiarity. She'd been here before. Not in this exact situation, not on this particular flight, but she'd stood in this invisible space countless times throughout her life. The space where people looked at her and decided in an instant that she didn't matter, that her voice could be ignored, that her rights could be dismissed, that whatever convenience they sought was more important than her dignity. The feeling transported her back through the years, back to when she was 23 years old, working the counter at a regional airport in Dallas, wearing a uniform that never quite fit right, standing behind a desk while passengers treated her like a vending machine that occasionally malfunctioned. She remembered the businessmen who would toss their tickets at her without making eye contact, the women who would snap their fingers to get her attention, the countless travelers who acted as if her only purpose in life was to serve them, accommodate them, solve their problems, and then disappear back into the furniture until needed again. Back then, Aries would go home to her tiny studio apartment after double shifts, her feet aching, her voice hoarse from saying "have a nice flight" hundreds of times to people who never once said thank you. She'd heat up ramen noodles or whatever was cheapest at the corner store, and she'd study. Business management textbooks borrowed from the library, industry reports printed at the local copy shop, financial statements from airlines both successful and failing, trying to understand what separated the two. She'd known even then that she wanted more, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever stood where she stood. For every gate agent who'd been yelled at over weather delays they couldn't control. For every flight attendant who'd smiled through harassment because they needed to keep their job. For every person in the service industry who'd been made to feel small by someone who'd forgotten that respect isn't earned by the size of your bank account. 23 years. That's how long it had taken her to go from that gate agent desk to the executive suite. 23 years of saving every dollar, of night classes and weekend seminars, of calculated risks and sleepless nights. She'd moved from gate agent to supervisor, from supervisor to operations coordinator, from coordinator to regional manager. She'd earned her MBA while working 50-hour weeks. She'd learned every aspect of the airline business, from maintenance schedules to fuel hedging strategies, from crew scheduling to customer service protocols. And when the opportunity came, when she heard about a small regional carrier drowning in debt and mismanagement, she'd taken every penny she'd saved, every relationship she'd built, every ounce of credibility she'd earned, and she'd bought her way in. 3 planes, 17 employees, debts that made her accountant physically ill. But Aries had seen something others hadn't. She'd seen potential, yes, but more than that, she'd seen a chance to build something different. Horizon Airways grew slowly at first. 1 new route, 2 new aircraft, a reputation for treating passengers like human beings and employees like assets rather than expenses. Word spread. Customers who were tired of being treated like cattle found their way to Horizon. Talented crew members who were burned out from toxic work environments applied for positions. Investors who believed in sustainable business models over quarterly profit squeezes started paying attention. Now, 15 years after that first acquisition, Horizon Airways operated 127 aircraft across 95 cities. 12,000 employees. 11 consecutive years of profitability. Industry awards for customer service and employee satisfaction. Aries had built exactly what she'd envisioned, not through ruthlessness or corner-cutting, but through a radical commitment to treating people with dignity. And she'd made another commitment along the way. She would never forget what it felt like to be invisible. She would never insulate herself so thoroughly from reality that she lost touch with the experience of the people who made her company run. That's why she traveled this way, dressed simply, sat in regular seats, waited in regular lines. Not as a publicity stunt or a social experiment, but as a reminder, a way to keep herself honest. But standing here now, in the aisle of her own aircraft, looking at Ryan Woods' dismissive expression, Aries felt something shift inside her. This time was different. This wasn't some random airline where she had no power, no voice, no recourse but to swallow the indignity and move on. This wasn't 20 years ago when she would have been forced to accept whatever crumb of respect someone like Ryan deigned to offer. This was her airline. These were her employees trying to serve him. This was her seat that he'd taken without asking. And more importantly, this was her company culture. The values she'd spent over a decade building, being challenged by a man who apparently believed that wealth and status exempted him from basic human decency. Ryan Woods had no idea who she was. He'd looked at her and seen someone easily dismissed, easily ignored, easily pushed aside for his convenience. He'd made the same mistake that hundreds of passengers had made with hundreds of service workers over the years. He'd forgotten that the person standing in front of him was a human being deserving of respect. But here's what made this moment different. What made Aries' pulse quicken not with anger, but with purpose. She had the power to teach him something. Not through force or humiliation, but through patience, through process, through letting him experience the natural consequences of his choices. She could show him what she'd learned over 23 years in this industry. That character matters more than credit limits, that how you treat people reveals more than what you own, and that real power comes from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. Aries took a slow breath, her boarding pass still held loosely in her hand. Around her, the cabin continued filling with passengers. A blonde woman in her early 30s had already settled into seat 3C and was watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. Across the aisle, a businessman in his 40s shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping this situation would resolve itself quickly. And beside Ryan, in the window seat of row 2, sat a woman in a red dress, her attention fixed on her phone, but her body language screaming awareness of the tension building beside her. This man, this Ryan Woods who sat in her seat with such casual disregard for her rights, had just handed her a teaching opportunity. And Aries Langston, who'd built an empire on the principle that everyone deserves respect, was about to accept it. She wasn't going to yell, she wasn't going to pull rank, she wasn't going to make a scene, she was going to stand her ground calmly and firmly and let this play out exactly as it should. Let the policies she'd written be enforced. Let the crew she'd trained handle the situation. Let Ryan Woods experience what happens when you treat people as if they don't matter, only to discover that they matter very much indeed. Because that's what this moment was really about. Not a seat, not a flight, but a fundamental question that had followed Aries throughout her entire journey. How do you use power when you finally have it? Do you wield it to elevate yourself, or to teach others what you've learned? Aries knew her answer. She'd known it since she was 23 years old, standing behind that gate agent desk, promising herself that if she ever had the chance, she would build something better. Aries didn't move from the aisle. She stood there, her boarding pass held firmly in her hand, her posture neither aggressive nor yielding. Just present. Just certain. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, something that made the passengers nearby pause in their movements. "Sir, I'm going to need you to check your boarding pass. This is seat 2A. It wasn't a request this time. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly where they stood and had no intention of being moved. Ryan's fingers stopped typing. He looked up at her again, and this time his expression had shifted from dismissive to irritated. He sighed, the kind of heavy, exasperated sigh that people use when they want everyone around them to know they're being inconvenienced by someone unreasonable. "Look," he said, his tone suggesting he was being extraordinarily patient with someone who didn't deserve it. "I need this seat for my work. The lighting is better here by the window. I'm sure you can find another seat in first class." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the cabin. "There are plenty of empty ones. It's really not that complicated." The assumption in his voice was crystal clear. She was making a big deal out of nothing. She was being difficult for no reason. Any reasonable person would simply take another seat and let him continue his important work. In Ryan Woods' mind, his needs didn't just take priority over hers. They existed on an entirely different plane of importance. Aries said nothing. She simply continued to stand there, her expression neutral, waiting. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and thick. Other passengers were beginning to notice now. The blonde woman in seat 3C, who'd been pretending to read a magazine, had given up all pretense. She watched the interaction with the fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Across the aisle, a businessman in his 40s wearing an expensive navy suit shifted in his seat, his discomfort visible. He glanced at Ryan, then at Aries, then down at his own phone, clearly hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring him to take sides or get involved. The woman in the red dress sitting in seat 2C, right next to Ryan by the window, had gone very still. She'd pulled out her phone and was staring at the screen with the intense focus of someone desperately wishing to be anywhere else. But her shoulders were tense, her body angled slightly away from Ryan, as if trying to create distance without actually moving. A young flight attendant appeared at the edge of the confrontation, drawn by the tension that had settled over the front of the cabin like fog. She was in her mid-20s, her uniform crisp and professional, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes worried. She'd been working for Horizon Airways for 2 years, long enough to know how to handle difficult situations, but not long enough to have lost the nervousness that came with confronting passengers who clearly considered themselves important. "Is everything all right here?" Jessica asked, her voice friendly but cautious. She looked between Aries and Ryan, trying to assess the situation quickly. Aries turned to her with a warm smile that reached her eyes, a stark contrast to the tension of the moment. "Yes, thank you. Just a seating mix-up. This is my assigned seat." She held out her boarding pass so Jessica could see it clearly. Seat 2A. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Jessica took the boarding pass, examined it, then turned to Ryan with a polite, professional smile. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Ryan's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, might tell this flight attendant that he didn't have time for this nonsense. But he was aware of the growing audience now. The way conversations had died down around them, the way heads were turning to see what was happening. With theatrical reluctance, making sure everyone understood what an imposition this was, Ryan reached into his jacket pocket and produced his boarding pass. He handed it to Jessica with the air of someone humoring a child who insisted on checking that 2 plus 2 still equaled 4. Jessica examined both boarding passes, and Aries watched the realization cross the young woman's face. She looked at Ryan's pass again, then at the seat he was occupying, then back at the pass in her hand. "Mr. Woods," Jessica said, her voice still professional but now carrying a note of certainty. "You're actually assigned to 2C, the aisle seat. This passenger has 2A, the window seat." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Ryan's face didn't show embarrassment or apology. Instead, it showed annoyance, as if the universe itself had made an error that now required him to deal with it. "The window seat has better light for my laptop," he said, as if this explained everything, as if this justified his appropriation of someone else's assigned seat. "I'm working on an important acquisition deal worth millions of dollars. Surely we can make an accommodation here." He looked at Jessica as if she were a problem solver whose job was to make his life easier, then glanced at Aries with an expression that suggested she was being unreasonably stubborn. "You can take the aisle seat," he said, framing it as a generous offer, rather than the presumptuous demand it actually was. "It's a perfectly good seat. You'll still be in first class. I don't see what the issue is." His tone implied that any work she might be doing, any reason she might have for selecting a window seat, couldn't possibly be as important as his million-dollar acquisition deal. The hierarchy was clear in his mind. His time, his work, his comfort mattered more than hers. Aries felt every eye in the first-class cabin on her. She felt the weight of Jessica's uncertainty, the young woman caught between company policy and the reality that Ryan Woods was clearly someone who expected special treatment. She felt the curiosity of the other passengers, wondering if she would back down, if she would accept the path of least resistance, and just take the aisle seat to keep the peace. She met Ryan's eyes directly and spoke with a voice that was calm, measured, and absolutely firm. "I selected the window seat specifically when I booked this flight. I'd appreciate it if you'd move to your assigned seat." The cabin fell silent. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone knows something significant is occurring, when the normal background noise of travel drops away and people become witnesses rather than participants. Ryan stared at her, and Aries could see him recalculating. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't being reasonable, at least not by his definition of reasonable, which apparently meant doing whatever was most convenient for him. He studied her face, her casual clothes, her unremarkable appearance, trying to figure out who she was, whether she was someone who might actually cause problems for him. Some passengers had their phones out now. Not obviously filming, but positioned in that casual way that suggested they were ready to capture whatever happened next. In the age of viral videos and social media justice, everyone understood that confrontations on airplanes could become public spectacles within hours. Ryan noticed the phones. He noticed the attention, and Aries could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Was this worth it? Was this seat worth creating a scene that might end up online with him cast as the villain? But she could also see his resistance, his fundamental unwillingness to accept that someone he deemed unimportant could successfully challenge him. The woman in the red dress beside him had pressed herself even further toward the window, her body language screaming her desire to be dissociated from whatever was happening in the seat next to her. The blonde woman in 3C had abandoned all pretense of doing anything other than watching. The businessman across the aisle had his phone out, though whether to film or simply to look busy was unclear. Jessica stood between them, holding both boarding passes, uncertainty written across her young face. She knew the policy. Passengers must sit in their assigned seats. But she also knew that Ryan Woods, based on his attitude and his expensive watch and his air of self-importance, was probably exactly the type of passenger airlines bend over backward to accommodate. The type who complained to corporate. The type who threatened to take his business elsewhere. The type who could make her job very difficult if she didn't handle this exactly right. Ryan broke the silence first, his voice taking on a tone of forced reasonableness, the kind of voice someone uses when they're trying to sound patient while actually being condescending. Look, clearly we got off on the wrong foot here. I don't want to hold up the flight. He glanced at the other passengers, playing to his audience now. I'm just trying to get some work done. This seems like a simple enough situation to resolve without making it into a federal case. He was reframing the narrative. She was the one making this difficult. She was the one being inflexible. He was just a busy professional trying to work, and she was creating drama over something that shouldn't matter. But Aries didn't rise to the bait. She didn't argue. She didn't justify. She simply stood there, immovable as stone, her boarding pass in her hand, her expression calm, waiting for the policy she'd written, the training she'd implemented, and the system she'd built to do exactly what it was designed to do. Treat everyone the same, no exceptions. Jessica looked at Aries, then at Ryan, then at the boarding passes in her hand. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, everyone waiting to see which way it would break. The silence stretched for another beat before Ryan shifted in his seat, leaning back slightly as if preparing to deploy a new strategy. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, a tone of false reasonableness mixed with poorly concealed condescension. "Miss," he began, and the way he said it made the word sound like a diminishment. "I understand you want the window seat. I get it, but I'm in the middle of critical work here. Time-sensitive negotiations that can't wait." He paused, letting that sink in, then delivered what he clearly thought was his trump card. "I'm Ryan Woods, CEO of Woods Capital Ventures. Perhaps you've heard of me?" He watched her face, waiting for the flicker of recognition, the moment when his name would register and her attitude would shift. He was used to that moment, used to people's expressions changing when they realized who he was, their posture adjusting, their voices taking on a different tone. But Aries' expression didn't change. She looked at him with the same calm, patient regard she'd shown from the beginning. No awe, no deference, no recognition whatsoever. Ryan's irritation deepened. The muscles in his jaw tensed visibly. "I'm sure you're very accomplished, Mr. Woods," Aries said, her voice steady and unimpressed. "But I'd still like my seat." The simplicity of her response seemed to throw him off balance. He'd expected pushback he could argue against, or compliance he could accept. But this quiet, immovable insistence, this refusal to engage with his importance, clearly frustrated him in a way he wasn't accustomed to. His jaw tightened further. He set down his phone, giving her his full attention for the first time, as if the weight of his focus might be enough to make her understand her mistake. "Look," he said, his voice hardening beneath the veneer of reasonableness, "I'll make this worth your while. Move to the aisle seat, and I'll have my assistant send you a voucher for a future flight upgrade. First class, anywhere Horizon Airways flies. That's a generous offer for a simple accommodation." The insult embedded in his offer was clear to everyone listening. He was offering to buy her compliance, assuming that money could solve this problem the way it apparently solved all his problems. He was assuming she had a price, and that her principles, her rights, her dignity could be purchased with the equivalent of a coupon. And underlying it all was the assumption that she should be grateful, that his generosity in offering her anything at all was more than someone like her deserved. Aries felt the familiar weight of that assumption. The belief that service workers, the people who looked like her, that anyone who didn't broadcast wealth and status, were naturally for sale if the price was right. Jessica stood frozen between them, her discomfort written across every line of her body. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes moving between Aries and Ryan like someone watching a tennis match she didn't want to be part of. She knew company policy. Every Horizon Airways employee knew it because Aries had made sure it was drilled into their training. Assigned seats must be honored. Passengers were entitled to the seats they'd selected and paid for. But Jessica also knew that Ryan Woods, based on everything about him, was exactly the kind of passenger who could make her life difficult. The kind who knew how to complain effectively, who had the platinum status that got corporate attention, who could get flight attendants written up or questioned about their customer service. She'd been trained to accommodate VIP passengers when possible, to go the extra mile for frequent flyers who represented significant revenue. Aries watched the young woman struggle with the competing pressures and felt a surge of empathy. She'd been there. She'd stood in that exact position, caught between doing what was right and doing what was easy, between policy and pragmatism. She spoke gently, directing her words to Jessica rather than Ryan. "What does company policy say about assigned seating?" Jessica blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. Then something shifted in her expression. She straightened slightly, her voice growing firmer as she recited from memory. "All passengers must occupy their assigned seats unless a change is mutually agreed upon or authorized by the gate agent." "There you go," Aries said with a small, encouraging smile. "Seems pretty clear." Ryan let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that had no humor in it. "Company policy? Are you serious right now? We're talking about a seat, not state secrets." "This is absolutely ridiculous." He looked at Jessica as if she'd betrayed him by remembering her training. "This is the kind of rigid, thoughtless rule-following that drives customers away. Use some common sense here." Around them, the other passengers' reactions were becoming impossible to ignore. The blonde woman in seat 3C leaned toward her companion, a man in his 30s with carefully styled hair, and whispered something behind her hand. Her expression was a mix of fascination and secondhand embarrassment. The businessman across the aisle, who'd been trying so hard to appear uninvolved, shook his head subtly, clearly embarrassed by Ryan's behavior, even though he was trying not to show it. The woman in the red dress beside Ryan had practically molded herself to the window, creating as much physical distance as possible while still remaining in her seat. She continued to stare at her phone, but her thumb wasn't moving across the screen. She wasn't actually doing anything. She was just hoping that by looking occupied, she might somehow avoid being associated with the man beside her. Ryan seemed to sense he was losing the room. He turned back to Jessica, his voice taking on an edge of command. "Get your supervisor. I want to speak to someone with actual authority who understands customer service. Someone who can make decisions instead of just reciting policy like a robot." Jessica's face flushed at the insult, but she maintained her professional composure. "Of course, Mr. Woods. I'll get the cabin service director right away." She nodded to both of them and headed quickly toward the galley, her relief at escaping the situation visible in the speed of her retreat. The moment Jessica disappeared, an awkward silence descended over the first-class cabin. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing down on everyone, making the air feel thicker. Passengers who'd been chatting fell quiet. Those who'd been on phones ended their calls. Everyone was paying attention now, even those pretending not to. Aries remained standing in the aisle, her boarding pass still in her hand, her posture relaxed but unmovable. She was patient. She could wait all day if necessary. This was her airline, her flight, her time. She had nowhere else to be except exactly where she was. Ryan, clearly frustrated by her continued presence, made a show of returning to his laptop. He typed aggressively, his fingers striking the keys harder than necessary, the clicking sound somehow angry. It was a performance, a way of communicating that she was inconveniencing him, disrupting his important work, forcing him to waste valuable time on a trivial matter. But Aries used the waiting time to observe him more carefully. She noticed the tension that radiated through his shoulders and neck, the rigid set of his spine. She noticed the way his eyes kept flicking up from his screen to check if she was still there, if she'd given up yet. She noticed the expensive pen clipped to his jacket pocket, the designer luggage tag on his briefcase, the subtle logo on his laptop case. Everything about him was curated to broadcast success, wealth, importance. This was a man, she realized, who had built his entire identity around being someone who mattered, someone who got what he wanted, someone who was catered to and accommodated and treated as special. He'd surrounded himself with people who said yes, who made his life easier, who never challenged him. And now, faced with someone who wouldn't bend, wouldn't accommodate, wouldn't recognize his importance, he was genuinely at a loss. Aries thought about her own journey to this moment. 20 years ago, almost to the month, she'd been standing behind a counter at a regional airport outside Dallas. She'd been wearing a uniform that was slightly too big, working a double shift to cover for a colleague who'd called in sick. She'd been saving every dollar she could, taking night classes in business management, dreaming of something more while dealing with passengers who treated her like furniture. She remembered the businessmen who would toss their tickets across the counter without looking at her face. The women who would snap their fingers to get her attention. The countless travelers who would speak to her in that specific tone people use when addressing service workers. That tone that said, "You are here to serve me and nothing more." She remembered going home with her feet aching and her voice hoarse, heating up cheap food in her tiny apartment, and studying financial reports until her eyes burned. But more than the exhaustion or the dismissal, she remembered the promise she'd made to herself. If she ever had power, if she ever made it to a position where she could influence how people were treated, she would use that power differently. She wouldn't become like the people who'd looked through her. She wouldn't forget what it felt like to be invisible. That promise had guided every decision she'd made in building Horizon Airways. It was why she'd written policies that protected employees from abuse. Why she'd created a culture that valued respect above revenue when the two came into conflict. Why she'd made it clear that platinum status didn't entitle anyone to treat staff poorly or ignore basic rules. And it was why she was standing here now, refusing to move, refusing to accommodate, refusing to teach Ryan Woods that his money and status meant he could take whatever he wanted from whoever seemed powerless to stop him. The cabin remained silent, except for the aggressive tapping of Ryan's keyboard and the low murmur of passengers further back who couldn't quite see what was happening, but could sense the tension. Somewhere in economy, a baby cried. The normal sounds of boarding continued around them, but in first class, time seemed suspended, everyone waiting to see how this would resolve. Aries stood patient as stone and waited. The wait wasn't long. Within 3 minutes, a woman in her late 40s emerged from the galley area, moving down the aisle with the confident stride of someone who'd navigated countless difficult situations. Sarah Mitchell had been with Horizon Airways for 15 years. Starting back when the airline was still a struggling regional carrier with more debt than planes. She'd seen the company transform, seen it grow, and she carried herself with the professional assurance of someone who knew her job inside and out. Jessica trailed slightly behind her, relief evident in her posture at having successfully escalated the situation to someone with more authority. Sarah took in the scene with experienced eyes. Ryan Woods sitting proprietarily in seat 2A, laptop still open, briefcase still occupying the adjacent seat. Aries standing calmly in the aisle, boarding pass in hand, her expression patient and unmoved. The other passengers watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. The tension that had settled over the cabin like static electricity before a storm. She approached with a practiced smile that was professional without being warm, the kind of smile that said she was here to solve problems, not make friends. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby but not so loud as to feel like a public announcement. "I understand we have a seating concern. I'm Sarah Mitchell, cabin service director for this flight. How can I help resolve this?" Before Aries could respond, Ryan seized the opportunity. He sat up straighter, his expression transforming from irritated to vindicated, as if the arrival of someone with real authority meant his ordeal was finally coming to an end. "Finally someone with sense," he said, his voice carrying a note of relief mixed with complaint. "I've been trying to work on a critical business matter, and this..." He gestured vaguely in Aries' direction, not quite looking at her, as if she were more situation than person. "Has been delaying the entire flight. Look, I need the window seat for proper lighting on my laptop. I'm a platinum member. I fly Horizon Airways weekly, sometimes twice weekly. I'm sure you can appreciate the value of accommodating your most loyal customers." He delivered this with the confidence of someone playing a winning card. His frequent flyer status, his loyalty, his value to the company. These were the currencies that mattered, and he'd just laid them all on the table. Sarah's expression flickered just for a moment, revealing the impossible calculation she was being asked to perform. Aries could see it clearly. The woman was caught between competing priorities that her training had drilled into her. Follow procedure. Treat all passengers fairly, but also keep high-value customers satisfied. Accommodate when possible. Prevent complaints that reach corporate. Ryan Woods, with his platinum status and weekly flights, represented tens of thousands of dollars in annual revenue. Multiply that by the potential years of his continued business, and you were looking at a customer the airline couldn't afford to lose. Sarah's voice remained diplomatic when she spoke. Mr. Woods, we certainly value your loyalty to Horizon Airways. However, all passengers have assigned seats. Perhaps we could find you an alternative window seat elsewhere in first class? I believe 5A is available. Ryan's response was immediate and dismissive. I'm settled here. My laptop is out, my briefcase is arranged, my work is already in progress. I'm not moving 3 rows back and disrupting my entire setup. That's not a solution. That's just relocating the problem. His tone made it clear the conversation was over as far as he was concerned. He'd stated his position, and he expected it to be accommodated. Sarah turned to Aries, and her expression shifted subtly. Not unfriendly, but there was a quality of gentle pressure in her voice now, the tone of someone trying to find the path of least resistance. Miss, would you be willing to accept a different seat? I see several available options, including 3A, another window seat just 1 row back. We could even offer you a complimentary beverage service for the inconvenience. This was the moment. Aries recognized it clearly. This was when most people would give in. Worn down by the hassle, embarrassed by the attention, tired of being the person holding things up, they would accept the compromise. Take the other seat. Let it go. Choose the path that let everyone move on with their day. Sarah's approach was subtle, but effective. She was framing compliance as reasonableness, as flexibility, as being the bigger person. She was making it easy for Aries to back down while saving face. But Aries had been here before, in different forms, throughout her entire life. She'd faced this pressure to accommodate, to compromise, to make herself smaller so others could be more comfortable. And she'd promised herself, years ago, that when she had the power to resist that pressure, she would. I appreciate your attempt to resolve this, Sarah, Aries said, her voice calm but carrying a note of finality. But I booked this specific seat weeks ago. I selected it deliberately, and I'd like to sit in it. That seems reasonable to me. Sarah's discomfort became more visible. She shifted her weight, glanced at Ryan, then back at Aries. In her 15 years with the airline, she'd learned that the easiest solution was usually the best one. Avoid conflict when possible. Make small accommodations to prevent large problems. Keep things moving smoothly. But there was something in Aries' calm certainty, in the quiet authority of her voice, that gave Sarah pause. This wasn't someone who was going to be easily persuaded. Ryan's patience, already threadbare, finally snapped. Oh, for heaven's sake, this is absurd! He looked around at the other passengers as if seeking validation for his frustration. We're holding up the entire flight because someone won't be flexible over a seat. I have a meeting in New York in 4 hours that affects hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in contracts. Can we please just resolve this like adults? The way he framed it was masterful manipulation. He was positioning his convenience as a matter of economic importance, of social responsibility. Aries wasn't just inconveniencing him. She was potentially harming all those employees, affecting all those contracts, delaying all these passengers. He was making her insistence seem selfish, petty, unreasonable. But then a voice cut through from row 4, a male passenger in his 50s with salt and pepper hair. Just give her the seat she paid for. We all want to leave on time, but she's not the one holding things up. There was a murmur of agreement from several other passengers. A woman across the aisle nodded. Someone else said, "He's in the wrong seat." Ryan's face flushed. He hadn't expected the other passengers to turn against him. He'd assumed they'd side with him, with efficiency, with getting the flight moving. Instead, they were siding with fairness, with policy, with the woman being told to compromise through no fault of her own. Sensing he was losing public opinion, Ryan shifted tactics. He turned back to Aries, and his expression rearranged itself into something that attempted patience, though the frustration still leaked through at the edges. Look, clearly we got off on the wrong foot here. Let's be adults about this. His voice took on a tone of forced reasonableness, as if he were the mature one trying to bring sanity to an irrational situation. What will it take for you to move? I'm serious. Name your price. A flight voucher? Multiple vouchers? An upgrade certificate good for a year? Premium status? Just tell me what you want and let's end this. The offer hung in the air, and Aries felt the weight of what it revealed. Ryan Woods genuinely believed that everyone could be bought. That every principal had a dollar amount attached to it. That resistance was just negotiation. That dignity was just a starting position in a bargaining process. His offer wasn't generous. It was insulting. It assumed that she, like everyone else in his world, would ultimately choose money over principle if the number got high enough. Around them, she could sense the other passengers' reactions. Some looked uncomfortable with the naked transactionalism of the moment. Others seemed curious about whether she'd accept, what her price might be. Aries met Ryan's eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Mr. Woods, I don't want anything except what I already have. A ticket for seat 2A. That's all I've ever wanted. That's all I'm asking for. The simplicity of her response seemed to stun him. He'd offered her money, status, perks, all the currencies that mattered in his world, and she'd dismissed them as if they were meaningless. As if what she already possessed, a simple ticket to a seat she'd paid for and selected, was worth more than anything he could offer. Sarah stood between them, holding both boarding passes still, though by now everyone knew what they said. She looked at Aries, then at Ryan, then down at the passes in her hands. Her expression showed the internal struggle clearly. She was a good employee, someone who'd dedicated 15 years to this company. She wanted to do the right thing. But what was the right thing when doing it might cost the airline a valuable customer? When it might generate a complaint that reached corporate? When it went against every instinct she'd developed about finding compromises and keeping things moving smoothly? The cabin had fallen silent again, everyone waiting to see which way Sarah would decide. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about what mattered more: policy or profit, fairness or convenience, principle or pragmatism. Sarah's hand tightened slightly on the boarding passes, and Aries could see the moment of decision approaching in the woman's eyes. Sarah's hesitation stretched into a long moment, and then someone from further back in the cabin called out, "Are we actually going to leave on time?" The question broke whatever spell had held the cabin suspended. Suddenly, passengers were checking their watches, pulling out phones to look at the time. A businessman in row 6 was already on his device, frantically texting someone about a potentially missed connection. A woman across the aisle sighed loudly, making her frustration known. The flight was now 20 minutes past scheduled departure. Sarah's expression shifted from conflicted to resolved. She looked at both boarding passes one final time, then lifted her eyes to meet Aries' gaze. "Please excuse me for just one moment," she said, her voice tight with the weight of the decision she was about to make. She walked quickly to the galley, picked up the internal phone, and Aries could hear her quiet voice even from several feet away. "Captain Reeves, we have a situation in first class that requires your attention." A ripple went through the cabin. Calling the captain was serious. This had escalated beyond a simple customer service issue into something that required the highest authority on the aircraft. Ryan's expression flickered between annoyance and something that might have been concern. Even he seemed to recognize that involving the captain meant the situation had moved beyond the realm where his status and money could easily smooth things over. Less than a minute later, the cockpit door opened and a man emerged. Captain David Reeves was in his mid-50s, his uniform crisp and perfectly fitted, his bearing that of someone who'd spent 3 decades making decisions where lives hung in the balance. His hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered but sharp, his eyes the kind that missed nothing. He moved with unhurried purpose down the aisle, and conversations died in his wake. There was something about a captain in uniform that commanded automatic respect, a reminder that for all the customer service and corporate policies, this aircraft was ultimately his domain. He took in the scene with those sharp, experienced eyes. Ryan still seated in 2A, postured defensive now rather than imperious. Aries standing in the aisle, calm and patient. Sarah holding 2 boarding passes and looking relieved that someone else was now handling this. The other passengers watching with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning, everyone," Captain Reeves said, his voice carrying natural authority without any need to raise it. "I'm Captain Reeves. We're going to sort this out quickly so we can get airborne. Someone want to explain what's happening?" Sarah stepped forward, grateful to hand the situation off to someone with clear authority to make final decisions. "Captain, we have a seating issue. This passenger," she gestured to Aries, "has a boarding pass for seat 2A. This passenger," she indicated Ryan, "is sitting in 2A, but his boarding pass is for 2C. He's refusing to move to his assigned seat." Captain Reeves nodded once, processing the information. He looked at Ryan with an expression that was professional but utterly unbending. "Sir, you're in the wrong seat. FAA regulations require all passengers to occupy their assigned seats for takeoff. Please move to 2C. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, followed by a clear instruction. Ryan's face tightened. He sat up straighter, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of familiarity, of attempted connection. "Captain, I'm Ryan Woods. Perhaps you know my firm, Woods Capital Ventures. We've invested in several aerospace companies, including some airline suppliers. I need the window seat for my work, for the lighting. Surely as captain, you have the authority to make reasonable accommodations for your passengers?" He was trying to establish himself as a peer, Aries realized. Not a passenger subject to the captain's authority, but a fellow professional operating at the same level of importance. Important man to important man. Surely they could work this out between them without all this fuss over regulations and assigned seats. Captain Reeves' expression didn't change. When he spoke, his voice remained level, but there was steel underneath the professionalism. "Mr. Woods, I don't care if you're the President of the United States. On this aircraft, FAA regulations and company policy apply to everyone equally. You have 2 options. Move to your assigned seat voluntarily, or I'll have airport security remove you from the flight. Those are your choices." The words landed like a gavel striking wood. Final. Unappealable. Ryan's face flushed, color rising from his neck to his cheeks. He wasn't accustomed to being spoken to this way, especially not in front of others. His carefully constructed image of himself as someone important, someone who commanded respect and deference, cracked visibly. "You're going to regret this," Ryan said, his voice shaking slightly with anger, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Do you have any idea how much I spend with this airline annually? I'll be filing a formal complaint with Horizon Airways corporate office the moment we land. This is unacceptable customer service. This is discrimination against loyal customers. This is—" "That's your right, sir," Captain Reeves interrupted, his tone suggesting he'd heard these threats countless times before and remained unmoved by them. "You're welcome to file any complaint you wish. But right now, you need to make a decision. Move to your assigned seat or leave the aircraft. We depart in 2 minutes either way." He pulled out his phone, and the gesture was clear. He was prepared to call airport security if necessary. This wasn't a bluff. Every passenger in first class was watching now. Several had their phones out, not even pretending anymore. They were recording this, capturing it, and Ryan knew it. In the age of social media, a video of him being escorted off a plane by security could spread across the internet in hours. His clients would see it. His competitors would see it. Everyone would see Ryan Woods, CEO of Woods Capital Ventures, being removed from a flight for refusing to follow basic rules. Aries watched the calculation happen behind Ryan's eyes. She could see him weighing his options, his pride against his pragmatism, his need to win against his need to avoid a public relations disaster. The cabin held its collective breath. With visible fury, Ryan slammed his laptop shut with enough force that several passengers flinched. "Fine," he bit out, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is absolutely ridiculous, but I don't have time for this nonsense." He stood abruptly, roughly grabbing his laptop and briefcase with jerky, aggressive movements. He shoved his belongings into his bag with unnecessary force, his anger manifesting in every gesture. As he moved from the window seat to the aisle seat, just one position over, but feeling like a massive defeat, he muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Some people just don't understand how the world works." The comment was directed at Aries, an attempt to save face, to reframe this as her failure to understand reality rather than his failure to follow rules. Aries didn't respond. She simply moved past him with unhurried grace, stepping into the space he'd finally vacated. She settled into seat 2A, the window seat she'd selected and paid for, arranging her small bag under the seat in front of her with calm, economical movements. She didn't acknowledge the drama that had just unfolded. She didn't gloat or show satisfaction. She simply sat down, as if this had always been inevitable, as if there had never been any question about where she would end up. Ryan sat rigidly in seat 2C, the aisle seat, his entire body radiating resentment. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands gripping his armrests with enough force that his knuckles went white. He didn't look at Aries, but his body language screamed everything he couldn't say. Fury, humiliation, the burning need to make someone pay for this indignity. Captain Reeves stood in the aisle for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across first class, making sure the situation was truly resolved. Before he turned to head back to the cockpit, he made brief eye contact with Aries. Something flickered in his expression, there and gone in an instant. It might have been recognition, or respect, or simply acknowledgement. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the flight deck, his presence having solved in 2 minutes what had taken 20 to escalate. Sarah Mitchell let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for the past several minutes. Her relief was visible in the way her shoulders dropped, the tension leaving her face. She moved to the front of the first-class cabin and raised her voice slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure." The announcement broke the spell. Conversations resumed, though more subdued than before. Passengers settled back into their seats. The normal sounds of pre-flight preparation filled the cabin as flight attendants moved through their final checks with practiced efficiency. Jessica appeared with bottles of water, distributing them with apologetic smiles. When she reached row 2, she set bottles on both tray tables, her movements careful and professional, treating both passengers with equal courtesy despite what had just transpired. The cabin door was secured with a heavy thunk. The jetway pulled back. Outside the window, ground crew gave their final signals. The aircraft's engines hummed to life, that deep thrumming sound that meant they were finally getting ready to move. Aries pulled out her tablet and opened the quarterly reports she'd been planning to review during the flight. Beside her, Ryan aggressively reorganized his workspace, setting up his laptop on the aisle seat's tray table with sharp, angry movements. The tension between them was thick enough to cut an invisible wall of resentment and unspoken words. But the plane was moving now, backing away from the gate, beginning its journey to the runway. The confrontation was over, or so it seemed. What Ryan Woods didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that the real reckoning was still to come. The aircraft rolled back from the gate with a gentle jolt, then began its slow taxi toward the runway. Outside the window, the sprawling landscape of Los Angeles International Airport slid past. Maintenance hangars, fuel trucks, other planes queued in their own journeys. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, and the sky above was that particular shade of California blue that promised perfect flying weather. Captain Reeves's voice came through the speakers, professional and reassuring. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The plane turned onto the runway, paused for a moment as the engines spooled up to full power, then accelerated smoothly down the asphalt. The nose lifted, the ground fell away, and within seconds, they were airborne. climbing steadily into that perfect blue sky. Los Angeles spread out beneath them, a vast sprawl of buildings and freeways and neighborhoods that slowly shrank as they gained altitude. Ryan hadn't spoken since taking his seat. He sat rigid in 2C, his laptop open on the tray table, his fingers attacking the keyboard with aggressive precision. Every keystroke seemed designed to communicate his displeasure, his continued anger at the indignity he'd suffered. He pulled out his phone the moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, connecting to the plane's Wi-Fi with practiced efficiency, and began making calls. Aries, in contrast, exuded tranquility. She'd pulled out her tablet and opened a series of documents, financial reports, and operational summaries, her eyes moving across the data with focused attention. Occasionally, she gazed out the window, watching the landscape transform below them as they climbed, Los Angeles giving way to mountains, mountains giving way to desert. 20 minutes into the flight, once they'd reached cruising altitude, Jessica appeared with the beverage cart. She approached row 2 with visible nervousness, her movements careful, her smile professional but uncertain. The confrontation earlier clearly still weighed on her. "What can I get you to drink?" she asked Aries first, following proper service protocol. Aries looked up with a warm smile that seemed to ease some of the tension in Jessica's shoulders. "Just water with lemon, please, Jessica. Thank you." Jessica blinked, surprise flickering across her face. The passenger had used her name. Most passengers in first class never looked at name tags, never bothered to learn who was serving them. But this woman had not only noticed, but used it naturally, warmly, as if Jessica were a person worth acknowledging rather than just a function. "Of course, right away," Jessica said, something in her voice softening. She turned to Ryan. "And for you, sir?" Ryan didn't look up from his laptop. His fingers continued typing, his eyes fixed on his screen. "Whiskey. Neat. Top shelf." "No, please. No, thank you." No acknowledgement that Jessica was anything more than a mechanism for delivering alcohol. Jessica nodded, poured the drinks, and moved on to the next row. But as she walked away, Aries noticed her glance back, curiosity evident in that look. Something about Aries had caught the young woman's attention, sparked something in her memory, though she clearly couldn't place what. Ryan's phone calls began shortly after. He made no effort to lower his voice, speaking loudly enough that everyone in the surrounding rows could hear every word. It was performative, Aries recognized, designed to reassert his importance after the earlier humiliation. "Paul, yeah, it's me," he said into his phone, his tone carrying an edge of aggrieved complaint. "You won't believe what just happened on this flight." Nobody made a huge scene about a seat assignment, refused to be reasonable about it, and the staff actually sided with her instead of handling it quietly, like professionals should. Aries continued reviewing her documents. But she heard every word. "I know, right?" Ryan continued, his voice growing more animated. 20 minutes we sat on the ground because she wouldn't accept a perfectly good alternative seat. The captain had to get involved. It was ridiculous. This airline service has really gone downhill. I'm seriously considering taking my business elsewhere. There are other carriers that actually appreciate loyalty. The revision of history was complete. In Ryan's retelling, he was the reasonable one. He was the victim of poor service, of an unreasonable passenger, of staff who failed to handle the situation properly. He'd erased his own role entirely. His appropriation of someone else's seat, his refusal to move, his attempts to buy compliance. Aries listened and made mental notes. Not about Ryan specifically, but about the pattern. This was how people like him maintained their self-image, she realized. By rewriting reality to match their narrative, by casting themselves as perpetually wronged rather than ever wrong. She continued her work, occasionally jotting notes on her tablet. Observations about service timing, questions about crew scheduling, ideas for training improvements. Even traveling incognito, even in the middle of personal drama, she was always studying her airline. An hour into the flight, the lunch service began. Flight attendants moved through first class with practiced choreography, delivering meals that had been carefully prepared. Herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, fresh mixed greens with vinaigrette, warm artisan bread with butter, a chocolate mousse for dessert. When Ryan's meal arrived, he barely glanced at it before his face arranged itself into an expression of dissatisfaction. I specifically requested kosher when I booked this flight. This isn't acceptable. Jessica, who was serving their row, pulled out her tablet and checked quickly. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't show any special meal request in your reservation. However, I'd be happy to see what other options we have available. Ryan waved his hand dismissively. Never mind. Just typical of how this entire flight has gone. He picked up his fork and began eating the meal he'd just claimed was unacceptable, his movements sharp with lingering irritation. When Jessica served Aries, the contrast was immediate. Aries smiled genuinely, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. This looks wonderful. Please thank the galley staff for me. I will. Absolutely, Jessica said. And there was something different in her voice now, a warmth that hadn't been there when serving Ryan. Other passengers in first class noticed the difference. The blonde woman in 3C, who'd been watching the entire drama since boarding, exchanged a meaningful glance with her companion. The businessman across the aisle, who was enjoying his own meal, looked between Ryan and Aries with an expression that suggested he'd formed clear opinions about who deserved to be in first class based on behavior rather than price of ticket. As the flight continued, Aries maintained her quiet observation. She noticed how Sarah, the cabin director, checked on first class more frequently than usual, her professional attention heightened by the earlier incident. And she noticed how each time Sarah passed, the woman's eyes would linger on her just a moment longer than necessary, that look of someone trying to place a familiar face. Ryan made another phone call, this one different in tone. His voice took on the quality of someone discussing serious business, and despite herself, Aries found herself listening more carefully. The Henderson deal, Ryan was saying, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction people get when discussing their own cleverness. We should be able to close within 60 days. The family doesn't realize how underwater they are. Once we acquire, we'll liquidate the manufacturing equipment, sell the real estate. That's where the real value is. Prime industrial location. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. 200 jobs, give or take, he continued, his tone suggesting this was merely a number on a spreadsheet rather than 200 families affected. But that's not our concern. We're not a charity. The business isn't viable long-term anyway. We're just accelerating the inevitable and making a profit doing it. For the first time since taking her seat, Aries' expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, a brief pressing of her lips together. Not judgment exactly, but awareness. She understood now, completely, what kind of businessman Ryan Woods was. The kind who saw companies as assets to be stripped rather than enterprises to be built. The kind who viewed employees as expenses to be eliminated rather than people with lives and families and mortgages. Ryan ended his call and glanced over, catching her looking in his direction. He misread her expression entirely, mistaking her moment of awareness for something else. Admiration, perhaps, or intimidation. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, his posture straightening slightly. See, his expression said. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is why I matter. I make million-dollar deals. I move markets. I'm not someone you challenge over a seat. Aries held his gaze for just a moment, her expression neutral, then returned her attention to her tablet. She made another note, though this one had nothing to do with airline operations. The flight continued. Clouds drifted past the window. The recycled air hummed through vents. Passengers dozed or worked or watched movies on their screens. And in row 2, 2 people sat side by side in silence, separated by mere inches and by a chasm of understanding. Ryan Woods had no idea who sat beside him, no idea that the woman he'd dismissed, the woman whose seat he'd taken, the woman he'd tried to buy off with vouchers and upgrades, owned the very aircraft they flew in. No idea that his complaint calls to business associates, his threats to take his business elsewhere, his casual cruelty in describing the destruction of 200 jobs, had all been heard by someone who would remember. The landing in New York was still hours away, but the real destination, the real reckoning, was approaching faster than Ryan could possibly imagine. 3 hours later, Captain Reeves's voice came through the speakers with the announcement passengers had been waiting for. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. We're beginning our initial descent into New York. Outside the window, the landscape had transformed completely. The desert and plains that had stretched endlessly below gave way to the dense urban sprawl of the East Coast. As they descended through scattered clouds, the New York City skyline emerged in the distance, towers of glass and steel catching the afternoon sun, glinting like jewels scattered across the horizon. Passengers around the cabin stirred to life, the particular energy that comes near journey's end. People stretched, checked their phones for the 100th time, began mentally transitioning from the suspended reality of flight to whatever waited for them on the ground. Ryan had been composing an email for the past 20 minutes, his fingers moving across his laptop keyboard with focused intensity. Aries couldn't see his screen, but she could guess what he was writing. A complaint letter to Horizon Airways corporate, detailed, thorough, scathing. She imagined he was naming names, demanding compensation, calling for disciplinary action against the staff who'd failed to accommodate him. In his mind, he was probably already drafting the groveling apology he expected to receive, already imagining the free flights and status upgrades they'd offer to keep his business. The aircraft descended steadily, that familiar feeling of pressure building in the ears, the subtle shift in engine tone. The ground rose up to meet them, details becoming clearer. Roads, buildings, cars moving like toys below. Then the runway appeared, and with a gentle bump and the roar of reverse thrust, they were down. The plane slowed, turned off the runway, and began the taxi to the gate. Ryan was already closing his laptop, already gathering his things before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. The moment that familiar chime sounded, he was on his feet, pulling his bag from the overhead bin with aggressive efficiency. All around the cabin, passengers were doing the same, standing in that awkward, hunched position under the low ceiling, crowding the aisle in the universal rush to deplane despite having nowhere to go until the door opened. Aries remained seated, watching the chaos with patient amusement. There was never any point in rushing. The door would open when it opened. The crowd would thin when it thinned. She had time. Ryan pushed forward through first class without a backward glance, not bothering with pleasantries or thank yous to the crew members who stood by the exit. Jessica offered him a polite, "Thank you for flying with us," but he was already past her, already in the jetway, already moving on to whatever important meeting or deal awaited him. He had places to be. Important places. People who mattered were waiting for him. As the aisle cleared, Aries stood unhurriedly, retrieved her small bag, and made her way toward the exit. Sarah Mitchell was standing near the door, supervising the deplaning process, her professional smile in place as she thanked passengers for choosing Horizon Airways. When she saw Aries approaching, something shifted in her expression. The professional mask slipped slightly, replaced by curiosity mixed with uncertainty. As Aries drew near, Sarah spoke quietly, her voice tentative. "Excuse me, miss?" She hesitated, then continued. "I'm so sorry, but are you... you look very familiar. Have we met before?" Aries paused, offering a gentle smile. "I've flown Horizon Airways many times, Sarah. I appreciate how you handled a difficult situation today." Something in Aries' tone, the way she spoke with quiet authority, the way she used Sarah's name with such natural familiarity, triggered something in the cabin director's memory. Sarah's eyes widened slightly as connections began forming. She'd seen employee training videos, corporate communications, newsletter photos from company events. Her face flushed as realization dawned. "Oh my God," she breathed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're Aries Langston. You're the owner." Aries' smile remained warm, untroubled. "I prefer to think of myself as just another passenger most of the time. But yes." The color in Sarah's face deepened, embarrassment and distress warring across her features. "I am so sorry about what happened today. If I had known who you were, I should have handled it differently. I should have enforced policy immediately, should have backed you up from the start, should have..." Aries raised a hand gently, interrupting the flow of apologies. You handled it exactly as you're trained to handle difficult situations. You tried to find a peaceful resolution while ultimately following policy. That's exactly what I hope all our crew members would do. But I almost asked you to move, Sarah said, her voice tight with the memory of that moment. I almost accommodated Mr. Woods instead of enforcing your right to your assigned seat. I was thinking about his status, about potential complaints, about revenue. I almost made the wrong choice. Almost, Aries said, her voice gentle but firm. But you didn't. And when Captain Reeves made the call, you supported it completely. That's what matters. She paused, her expression thoughtful. However, I think this incident highlights something we need to address in our training programs. Sarah leaned in slightly, her attention completely focused. What do you mean? The assumption that certain passengers are more valuable than others, Aries explained. That customers with status deserve different treatment, different consideration. The pressure you felt today to accommodate Mr. Woods because of his platinum status? That's a systemic issue. Every person who boards our aircraft deserves the same respect and service, whether they're flying for the first time or the 1,000th. Status might earn perks, upgrades, priority boarding. But it doesn't earn the right to disrespect others or ignore basic policies. Sarah nodded slowly, recognition evident in her expression. You're absolutely right. I felt that tension so clearly today, trying to balance customer satisfaction with fairness. I knew what policy said, but I also knew what accommodating a high-value customer might mean for the airline. What's Mr. Woods' frequent flyer status? Aries asked. Sarah pulled out her tablet, accessing the passenger manifest with practiced efficiency. Platinum Elite. He's flown 87 segments with us in the past year. Significant loyalty, Aries acknowledged. When you file your flight report, I'd like you to include a detailed account of today's incident. Everything that happened, from the initial seating issue to the captain's intervention. I want Mr. Wood's behavior properly documented. Of course, Ms. Langston. And please send me Captain Reeves' contact information, Aries continued. I'd like to commend him personally for how he handled the situation. His clarity and firmness were exactly right. I'll have everything to you by end of day, Sarah promised, her professional composure returning now that she had clear direction. Aries gathered her bag and moved toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear Sarah quietly briefing other crew members, explaining who their passenger in the gray sweater had been. She caught whispers of surprise, embarrassment, respect. Jessica's eyes were wide when Aries passed her at the door. Thank you for flying Horizon Airways, Ms. Langston, the young woman said, her voice carrying new understanding of why the passenger had been so gracious despite the confrontation. Thank you, Jessica, Aries replied warmly. You did well today. Aries walked up the jetway into the terminal, the familiar organized chaos of JFK surrounding her. Travelers rushed past in both directions, pulling rolling bags, checking phones, calling out to companions. Gate agents made announcements. Children ran ahead of tired parents. The airport symphony played on. And there, about 30 feet ahead near a seating area, was Ryan Woods. He had his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing animatedly as he spoke. His voice carried across the terminal. I'm telling you, it was completely unacceptable. The captain actually threatened to have me removed from the flight. Me. Over a seat. I've already drafted a formal complaint. I'm going to name everyone involved. This kind of treatment is inexcusable. Aries paused, standing still in the flow of deplaning passengers, watching him. She could walk past, could head to her meeting, could let this entire incident fade into just another story about dealing with difficult passengers. She could implement some training improvements, maybe add a note to Ryan's passenger profile, and move on. But something stopped her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even really about Ryan Woods specifically. It was about the pattern he represented, the mindset he embodied. The belief that money and status entitled him to treat others poorly, to ignore rules that applied to everyone else, to rewrite reality to cast himself as perpetually wronged. And more than that, it was about his complete lack of self-awareness, his absolute certainty that he'd been in the right. This wasn't just about one flight or one seat. It was about whether people like Ryan Woods ever faced real consequences for their behavior. Whether they ever learned that their actions had meaning beyond their immediate convenience. Aries pulled out her phone and made a call. The person on the other end answered on the second ring. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need you to do something for me." "Daniel," Aries said into her phone, her voice quiet but clear over the terminal noise. "I need you to do something for me." Daniel Park, Horizon Airways Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, had worked with Aries long enough to recognize the tone in her voice. Something significant had happened. "Of course. What do you need?" Aries watched Ryan gesticulate into his phone 30 feet away, his voice still carrying across the terminal as he described his grievances to whoever would listen. "There's a passenger named Ryan Woods who just arrived on my flight from LAX. Platinum Elite status. He's currently standing near Gate 47, lodging a complaint about today's flight. I need you to contact him personally and invite him to the executive lounge. Tell him senior management wants to discuss his experience and address his concerns directly. Should I mention you'll be meeting with him?" "No," Aries said firmly. "Just that senior management wants to speak with him about appropriate resolution. Keep it professional, but make it clear we're taking his complaint seriously." There was a pause on the line. "Are you sure you want to handle this personally?" "I can send someone from customer relations?" "Very sure, Daniel, this is important. Consider it done. I'll have him there within the hour." Aries ended the call and moved to a quiet corner of the terminal where she could observe without being noticed. She pulled out her tablet and began responding to emails, but kept Ryan in her peripheral vision. 7 minutes later, his phone rang. She watched his expression shift from irritated to surprised to satisfied as he listened to whoever was on the line. His posture straightened. He nodded several times, said something brief, then ended the call with a small, vindicated smile. He looked around as if expecting someone to witness his triumph, then gathered his belongings and headed toward the terminal's main corridor, following signs toward the executive lounge. Aries gave him a 5-minute head start, then followed. The Horizon Airways executive lounge at JFK was a study in understated elegance. None of the flashy opulence some airlines favored, but rather a space designed for comfort and productivity. Natural light streamed through large windows overlooking the tarmac. Comfortable seating areas were arranged to provide both privacy and openness. A quiet workspace section offered individual desks with outlets and privacy screens. Along one wall, a buffet offered premium snacks, fresh fruit, artisan sandwiches, and a selection of beverages from coffee to craft beer. It was sanctuary from the chaos of the terminal, a space where the airline's most loyal travelers could work, rest, or simply breathe before their next journey. Ryan entered the lounge with the bearing of someone who'd been proven right. His earlier frustration had transformed into satisfaction. "See?" his entire posture seemed to say. "They know who I am. They know they messed up. Now they're going to make it right." He helped himself to coffee from the premium machine, selected a leather chair in a semi-private corner with a good view of the entrance, and settled in. He checked his watch, a gesture that communicated he was a busy man, willing to spare some of his valuable time for this meeting, but not unlimited amounts. 10 minutes passed. Ryan's confidence remained intact, though his foot began tapping slightly. He pulled out his phone, responded to a few emails, composed his thoughts. In his mind, he was preparing his list of demands. A formal written apology from the captain and crew. Substantial compensation, perhaps 50,000 bonus miles. Upgraded status for the following year. And most importantly, confirmation that the staff who'd handled the situation poorly would face consequences. Another 5 minutes. His impatience was growing now, but he rationalized it as exactly what he'd expected. Make the important customer wait just long enough to soften him up before the apology. Then the lounge door opened, and Aries walked in. She'd changed nothing about her appearance. Still the same light gray sweater, the same dark blue jeans, the same white sneakers. Her curly hair still fell loosely around her shoulders. She carried herself with quiet confidence as she crossed the lounge, her eyes finding Ryan immediately. Ryan looked up from his phone, and his expression went through a rapid series of changes. Confusion. Recognition. More confusion. His brow furrowed. You? The word came out almost as an accusation. He glanced around the lounge as if expecting someone else to appear, someone who made sense. What are you doing here? This is an executive lounge. It's for platinum members and higher status. Aries approached his seating area with unhurried steps and settled into the chair across from him, her posture relaxed but alert. Hello again, Mr. Woods. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Ryan's irritation flashed across his face. I'm waiting for someone from Airline management, someone senior who can actually address my complaint. I'm not interested in continuing our earlier disagreement. He made a dismissive gesture. Please leave. Aries met his eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. I am Airline management, Mr. Woods. In fact, I am the airline. My name is Aries Langston, and I'm the majority owner of Horizon Airways. The words hung in the air between them like a held breath. Ryan stared at her. Several seconds passed. Then a laugh escaped him, uncertain and slightly nervous. You're joking. This is some kind of prank. Did Paul set this up? He looked around again, as if cameras might be hidden somewhere, as if this were some elaborate practical joke. Aries said nothing. She simply pulled out her phone, opened it with a swipe of her finger, and slid it across the small table between them. On the screen was the Horizon Airways executive portal, a system Ryan had never seen but could immediately recognize as legitimate. The interface showed administrative access at the highest level, and there, clearly visible, was a profile. Aries Langston, Chief Executive Officer and Majority Owner. Her photograph, professional and clear, matched the woman sitting across from him. Below it, access credentials that indicated she could see and control virtually every aspect of the airline's operations. The color drained from Ryan's face like water from a broken glass. His expression cycled through disbelief, recognition, horror, and finally settled on deep, crushing embarrassment. His hand trembled slightly as he slid the phone back across the table, unable to meet her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ambient sounds of the lounge continued around them. The quiet hum of conversation from other travelers, the soft clink of cups on saucers, the muted CNN broadcast from a television in the corner. But at their table, silence reigned. Ryan seemed to physically shrink in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog under sunlight. Everything that had made him feel large and important moments ago had inverted, leaving him feeling exposed and small. He finally found words, though they came out stammered and uncertain. Ms. Langston, if I had known who you were, I didn't realize. I never would have. Aries raised one hand, a gentle but firm gesture that stopped his stumbling apology mid-sentence. Stop, she said quietly. Let me be very clear about something, Mr. Woods. The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is how you treated me when you thought I was nobody. Ryan tried to speak. I didn't mean to. You took my seat without asking. Aries continued, her voice still quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. When I politely informed you it was mine, you ignored me as if I hadn't spoken. When I persisted, you offered to buy me off with vouchers and upgrades, as if my dignity had a price tag. You called your business associates and complained about nobodies making scenes. You've spent the past hour trying to get people disciplined or fired for doing their jobs correctly, for following the policies I wrote. Each word landed with precision, and Ryan flinched as if physically struck. He couldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere on the table between them. All of this, Aries said, because you believed your status, your wealth, your importance made you more valuable than everyone else, because you thought the rules that apply to other people shouldn't apply to you. Ryan's face had gone from pale to flushed, embarrassment and shame warring across his features. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as if needing something solid to hold on to. Aries leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a different quality. Not harsh, but firm. Teaching. Do you know why I travel the way I do, Mr. Woods? Why I don't announce myself? why I dress simply, why I sit in regular seats and wait in regular lines like everyone else. Ryan shook his head mutely, words having completely abandoned him. Aries leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression softening just a fraction. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory and hard-earned wisdom. 23 years ago, I was a gate agent at a small regional airport in Texas. I worked double shifts to make ends meet, took night classes in business management, saved every dollar I could. To most passengers, I was invisible. They looked through me, talked over me, dismissed me without a second thought. I was just part of the furniture, something that facilitated their journey but didn't really exist as a person. Ryan had gone completely still, his earlier defensiveness replaced by something else. He was listening now, truly listening, perhaps for the first time since they'd met. I watched how people with power used it, Aries continued. Some were kind, generous, aware of their impact on others. They remembered that service workers were human beings with dreams and struggles of their own. But many were like you, Mr. Woods. They believed their success gave them permission to treat people in service positions as lesser beings. They thought money could excuse rudeness. They assumed their time was inherently more valuable than anyone else's. She paused, letting the words settle between them. I promised myself two things if I ever had power. First, I would never forget what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated as if I didn't matter. Second, I would build a company where every person, whether staff or passenger, was treated with dignity, not as a marketing slogan, but as a fundamental operating principle. It took 15 years of brutal, exhausting work, Aries said, her voice carrying the memory of those years. I started as that gate agent, became a supervisor, moved into operations management, earned my MBA taking classes at night after full workdays. I saved and invested wisely, learned every aspect of the airline business from the ground up. When I was 38, I bought my first small regional airline. It had 3 planes and a mountain of debt. Everyone said I was crazy, that I'd lose everything. Ryan's eyes never left her face. But I had a vision. An airline that actually cared about people, not just quarterly profits. Where staff were trained to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their ticket class or status. Where policies meant something and applied equally to everyone. Where the culture from the top down was about genuine service, not servitude. She gestured toward the window, toward the airport visible beyond. Now Horizon Airways has a fleet of 127 aircraft. We employ 12,000 people. We serve 95 cities across the country. We've been profitable for 11 straight years running. And do you know what our secret is? Ryan's voice came out barely above a whisper. What? We treat people well, Aries said simply. Our employees stay because they're respected and paid fairly. Our customers remain loyal because they're treated like human beings, not just revenue sources. It's not complicated. It's not revolutionary. It's just basic human decency applied consistently. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. When I saw you on that plane today, I saw every entitled passenger I've ever dealt with. Every person who thought their money made them better than others. Every traveler who forgot that the people serving them were real human beings with their own dignity. And I decided it was time for a teaching moment. I'm so sorry, Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't have any excuse for my behavior. There's no justification for how I acted. Aries' expression softened further. I'm not telling you this to humiliate you, Mr. Woods. I'm telling you because I believe people can change. I've seen it happen throughout my career. But real change requires 2 things: honesty about who we've become, and a genuine willingness to be different. She paused, studying his face. So here's what I want to know. Are you willing to hear what I observed about you today? Not just on the plane, but the pattern of behavior it revealed? Ryan nodded slowly. Yes. Please. I need to hear it. You're clearly intelligent and successful, Aries began, her tone neither harsh nor gentle, simply honest. You've built a company, made difficult decisions, created value in the marketplace. Those are real accomplishments that required skill and determination. But somewhere along the way, you started believing your success made you more important than other people. You stopped seeing service workers as human beings with their own stories and dignity. You developed a worldview where your needs automatically take precedence, where rules apply to others, but not to you. Each word landed with quiet force, and Ryan absorbed them without deflection. And I'd be willing to bet this isn't the first time you've behaved this way, Aries continued. It's probably a pattern, snapping at servers in restaurants, dismissing your assistant's concerns, cutting in lines because your time matters more, small acts of entitlement that you justify because you're busy, because you're important, because your work affects so many people. Ryan closed his eyes briefly, and Aries could see the truth of her observations registering in every line of his face. When he opened them again, there were tears at the corners. "You're right," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "God help me. You're completely right about all of it." He took a shaky breath. "I built my company from nothing too. I was hungry, determined, willing to outwork anyone. But somewhere along the way, I started measuring my worth by how much people deferred to me. I surrounded myself with people who said yes, who accommodated my every whim, who treated me like I was special. And I started believing it. I started thinking that was normal, that I deserved that treatment." Aries remained quiet now, letting him process and speak. "My assistant quit last month," Ryan continued, the words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. "Jennifer, she'd been with me for 6 years. She just walked out one day, left a letter on my desk saying she couldn't work for someone who treated her like an appliance instead of a person. I was furious at first. Thought she was ungrateful. Didn't appreciate everything I'd done for her career. But now..." He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. "My marriage ended 3 years ago," he went on, his voice quieter now. "My ex-wife, Lauren, told me I'd become someone she didn't recognize. That the man she married, the one who'd been kind and thoughtful and grateful for what he had disappeared. My teenage daughter barely talks to me anymore. When she does, it's with this distance, like she's talking to a stranger she has to be polite to." His hands gripped the business card Aries had given him earlier, which was still on the table. "I have dozens of business acquaintances, but no real friends. No one I can actually talk to about anything that matters. And I've been telling myself it's because success is lonely, because people are jealous of what I've achieved, because I'm too busy building something important to maintain relationships. But that's not it, is it?" His voice cracked. "It's because I've become insufferable. I've become exactly the kind of person I would have hated when I was starting out, the kind of person I used to criticize." Aries felt unexpected compassion wash over her. "Mr. Woods, the fact that you can see that you can be honest about it, is significant. Most people in your position never get to that point of self-awareness. They surround themselves with yes men and enablers and die believing their own mythology." Ryan looked up at her, his eyes red. "What happens now? Are you going to ban me from flying Horizon Airways? Because honestly, I would deserve it." A small smile touched Aries' lips. "No. I'm going to offer you something different. A chance to do better." Ryan waited, hardly breathing. "I'm not going to punish you for today's behavior," Aries said clearly. "The staff handled the situation appropriately, following the procedures and policies I established. The situation resolved itself through proper channels. And more importantly, you've clearly learned something from this experience. But I am going to hold you accountable going forward." She held up one finger. "Your platinum status with Horizon Airways will continue. You're welcome to fly with us anytime, but your account has been flagged for observation. If there are further incidents of you mistreating staff, being rude to passengers, or acting entitled, we'll have another conversation." She held up a second finger. "And if there's a third incident, you'll find yourself permanently banned from Horizon Airways. Not because I'm vindictive, but because I meant what I said about creating a culture of respect." "That's more than fair," Ryan said immediately. "It's more grace than I showed you today." "There's something else," Aries continued. I'd like you to spend some time thinking about how you treat people in your daily life. Not just on planes, but everywhere. Your employees, service workers, people you encounter who have less power than you in any given situation. Start noticing your behavior. Notice when you're about to be dismissive or rude, and in that moment, choose differently. I'm not asking you to be perfect, she added gently. I'm asking you to be aware. To remember that every person you meet is someone's child, someone's parent, someone with hopes and struggles and dignity that deserves to be respected. I will, Ryan said, his voice firm despite the emotion. I promise you, I will. I need to. Aries reached into her bag and pulled out a simple business card, cream-colored with elegant black text. Just her name and a direct email address. Nothing ostentatious. She slid it across the table. If you'd like to continue this conversation at some point, or if you want to share how you're doing with this commitment, my email is there. I mean that genuinely. I'm not just saying it to be polite. Ryan picked up the card carefully, holding it as if it were something precious and fragile. Thank you, he said, his voice thick. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it. Aries stood, gathering her bag. We all deserve chances to be better, Mr. Woods. That's what I believe. Now I have a meeting to get to, and I'm sure you have business to attend to as well. She turned toward the lounge exit, but before she'd taken 3 steps, Ryan's voice stopped her. Ms. Langston? She turned back. Yes? Ryan had stood as well, facing her with an expression that was raw and honest in a way his face probably hadn't been in years. For what it's worth, the way you handled today, the grace you showed even when I was at my absolute worst, that's real leadership. That's the kind of person I want to become. Aries held his gaze and smiled, a real smile that carried warmth and hope. Then become that person, Mr. Woods. Not overnight, not perfectly, but intentionally, day by day, choice by choice. That's all any of us can do. She walked out of the lounge, leaving Ryan standing there holding her business card, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a mantle he'd have to learn to carry. 3 months later, Aries sat in her corner office on the 15th floor of Horizon Airways headquarters, late afternoon sun streaming through the windows and painting everything in shades of gold. Outside, the airport spread out below, a living organism of movement and purpose, planes arriving and departing in their endless dance. Her computer chimed softly, announcing a new email. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar sender name, though the subject line caught her attention immediately. An update and an apology. She opened it and began to read. Dear Ms. Langston, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out and let you know how our conversation has impacted my life over the past 3 months. First, I owe you a more thorough apology than I gave that day in the lounge. I've spent considerable time reflecting on my behavior, not just on that flight, but in all areas of my life. You were right about everything you observed. I had become someone I'm not proud of. I want you to know I've made concrete changes. I've enrolled in therapy to work on my entitlement issues and to understand why I felt the need to assert dominance in every situation. It's uncomfortable work, but necessary. I've also made changes in my company. We've implemented new policies around respectful workplace conduct, starting with me. I've apologized to my assistant Jennifer, who returned to work after we had several honest conversations about how I need to change and what that looks like in practice. I've reached out to my daughter and ex-wife, acknowledging my failings and asking for opportunities to rebuild those relationships. It's a slow process, but we're making progress. Perhaps most importantly, I've started noticing all the small moments where I have the choice to be kind or dismissive. The server at lunch, the person cleaning my office building, the flight attendant on a business trip. I'm not perfect at it yet, but I'm trying. Last week, I was on another Horizon Airways flight. There was a family traveling with young children, clearly overwhelmed and stressed. The mother apologized profusely as her toddler cried during boarding. In the past, I would have been annoyed, might have even made a comment. Instead, I told her she was doing great, and offered to help put their bags in the overhead bin. It was a small thing, but her relieved smile made me realize how easy it is to make someone's day better instead of worse. You taught me that success without humility is just arrogance, and that power without compassion is just tyranny. I'm working every day to be better, to measure my worth not by how much people defer to me, but by how I make people feel. Thank you for giving me a second chance I didn't deserve. Thank you for seeing potential in me when you had every right to just see a problem to be removed. And thank you for building a company that stands for something more than profit. With sincere gratitude and respect, Ryan Woods Aries sat back in her chair, a smile crossing her face. She read the email once more, then began typing her reply. Dear Mr. Woods, thank you for your email and for your honesty about your journey. The fact that you're doing this work, really doing it, and not just performing change for show, speaks volumes about your character. I want you to know something. I never doubted you could change. I've seen people transform when they're given honest feedback and a path forward. The question was never whether you could change, but whether you would choose to. You've chosen growth over ego, and that takes real courage. Keep going. There will be days when you slip back into old patterns. We all do. What matters is that you notice, acknowledge it, and choose differently the next time. Progress isn't perfection, it's intention. The work you're doing in your company and with your family will have ripple effects you can't even imagine. Every person you treat with dignity will carry that experience forward. Every employee who sees you model respect will do the same. That's how culture changes, one interaction at a time. You're always welcome on Horizon Airways, not just as a passenger, but as someone I respect for having the humility to learn and grow. Keep in touch. I'd like to hear how your journey continues. Best regards, Aries Langston. She sent the email and turned her chair to face the window. The airport spread out below her in all its complexity, planes arriving and departing in their careful choreography, each one carrying hundreds of stories, hundreds of people traveling for business or pleasure, joy or sorrow, opportunity or obligation. She thought about why she did this work, why she'd insisted on building a different kind of airline. It wasn't just about transportation or profit margins, though those mattered. It was about creating spaces where human dignity was honored, where people were seen and valued regardless of their status or position. The encounter with Ryan Woods wasn't just about one arrogant passenger learning a lesson. It was about the culture she'd worked so hard to build, the values she refused to compromise, and the fundamental belief that how we treat each other matters more than any bottom line. There would be other Ryan Woodses. There would be passengers who tested her staff, who pushed boundaries, who believed their money entitled them to special treatment. But there would also be moments of grace, instances of kindness, passengers who appreciated being treated with respect, employees who thrived in an environment that valued their dignity. When she was gone, when someone else ran Horizon Airways, she wanted the culture to remain. She wanted future gate agents and flight attendants to know they mattered, to understand that their dignity wasn't dependent on a passenger's approval. She wanted travelers to experience what air travel could be when it was built on respect rather than hierarchy. She remembered standing in that aisle, holding her boarding pass, facing a man who looked right through her. In that moment, she'd had choices. She could have pulled rank immediately, embarrassed Ryan publicly, had him removed from the flight in the most dramatic way possible. Instead, she'd chosen patience. She'd let the situation play out through proper channels. She'd chosen to teach rather than punish, to invite growth rather than simply mete out consequences. And because of those choices, one person's worldview had shifted. One businessman had begun questioning his assumptions. One man had started treating people better. That was worth more than any dramatic confrontation would have been. That was the kind of leadership she believed in. Quiet, consistent, focused on long-term transformation rather than short-term satisfaction. As the sun set over the airport, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Aries returned to her work. There were reports to review, decisions to make, an airline to run. But she did so with renewed conviction that the work mattered, that how we treat each other mattered, that dignity and respect weren't luxuries to be earned but rights to be honored. And somewhere in the city, Ryan Woods was trying to be better, one choice at a time. That was the real victory. That was the lesson that would last long after the memory of one confrontation on one flight had faded. Because in the end, it was never really about the seat. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter and choosing to honor it, even when we hold the power to dismiss or diminish. That's what true success looks like. That's what real power means. And that's a lesson worth learning, no matter how long it takes. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.